Committee will come to order without objection. Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time pursuant to Committee Rule 5B and House Rule 11. Chair may postpone further proceedings on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment on which a recorded vote on the ayes and nays are ordered. First item for consideration is H.R. 5925, the Crisis Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5925, to codify provisions related to the Office of National Drug Control and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And before I start, I want to commend the committee staff on both sides for all of your hard work on this bill. I know it took a lot. You gave it blood, sweat, and tears, and I really do appreciate it, and America will appreciate it. They have devoted many hours and an incredible amount of effort to this legislation. I want each and every one of you to know how much every member of this committee, Democrats and Republicans, appreciate your dedication. The bill we are considering today is a good one. It would increase ONDCP's control over budgets of agencies to help direct resources where they are most needed. It also would strengthen data collection and analysis. In addition, I am also thankful that last night, Chairman Gowdy agreed to 3 additional proposals that I requested, and I am truly, truly grateful. For the first time ever, we will create a treatment coordinator within ONDCP. There's already an interdiction coordinator, and my proposal will help ensure that there's also someone to coordinate efforts to expand the availability and the quality of evidence-based treatment. Creating this position is an important step to enhancing ONDCP's efforts on treatment, which is critical to effectively and efficiently combating this crisis. In addition, we will ensure that ONDCP has the resources it needs to carry out not only its current responsibilities, but also the new responsibilities set forth in this vital legislation. Finally, we will require ONDCP, through an advisory committee, to develop and promulgate model standards for treatment facilities. We need evidence-based treatment. But right now, too many so-called treatment facilities are taking advantage of desperate families, charging outlandish prices, bilking insurance companies, and failing to help those who are in need. I thank the Chairman for agreeing to these requests. With his commitments on this proposal, I support this bill and encourage my colleagues to support it as well. With that said, I will continue to emphasize one key point. I know I may sound like a broken record, but this point is so crucial and critical. Reauthorizing ONDCP is important to make sure our nation has a strategy to combat the opioid epidemic. But if we fail to dedicate significant new funding for treatment, our efforts here will simply be meaningless. There will be nothing but moving around the deck chairs on the Titanic. Sadly, when I asked my Republican colleagues to support funding for treatment, here's what they say. Sorry, our leadership says we can't do that. Our leadership says that we can't spend any new money on the opioid crisis. Our leadership says that we need to find an offset. Our leadership says that we just don't have the votes for new spending. With all due respect, the same Republican leaders just passed a $1.5 trillion tax cut for the richest corporations and the wealthiest individuals in our country, and they didn't pay for it. They didn't find an offset for it. They rammed it through because it was a priority for them. So while I support the bill we are considering today, let me address my Republican colleagues as directly as I can from my heart. I've spoken with many of you face-to-face, eye-to-eye. Just yesterday, Chairman Meadows told me about his own experience witnessing the pipeline of individuals struggling with addiction for years without adequate treatment, just to become part of the latest statistic on overdose deaths. Others have shared with me very personal stories about your own constituents and even your own loved ones who are dying every single day. And the other day when our chairman described what a family had gone through that he had known, and I'm sure he could tell many, many other stories, those stories are going on every single day. And if they have not touched you yet, just keep on living. It may be a wife, it may be a cousin, it may be a neighbor, it may be a friend. And so I know you understand that this is the most devastating health crisis we have witnessed in 3 decades, and it affects many of the souls you represent. In closing, we may pass this bill today. We may pass it on the floor in June. We may work with the Senate to send some version of it to our President. But then the new fatality numbers will come out. They will show overdose deaths continuing to rise. They will show emergency room visits increasing again. They will show the economic costs of this crisis going through the roof in every state of the Union and every district in the Union. And so today we cannot pat ourselves on the back and say, job well done. No, 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 no. This is a fine bill, thanks to our chairman and all of those who have worked on it. And it is a good bill. But this bill will not make a dent in the opioid crisis without increased funding for treatment. For that, we need new leaders in Congress who are willing to put the priorities of the American people first. We need leaders like we had 30 years ago who supported treatment funding on a bipartisan basis to take on the greatest health crisis of this generation, the AIDS crisis. As we move forward, I sincerely hope that we in this room will be among those new leaders. And again, Chairman Gowdy, from the depths of my heart, I thank you. I thank you for reaching out, and I thank you for doing everything that you could to make this a truly bipartisan bill. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. Chair will now recognize himself for a brief opening statement. Our country is in the throes of an opioid crisis. Our fellow Americans and communities all across the land are losing loved ones to death by overdose or living with the daily consequences of addiction. As we highlighted in our hearing last week, the problem is worsening, and our country is in desperate need of a central coordinated government response at the national level because, for other reasons, in addition to other reasons, drugs do not respect territorial or geographic boundaries. The Office of National Drug Control Policy, which is an entity situated within the Executive Office of the President, plays a critical role in coordinating the nation's drug control policy and programs. With 16 federal departments and agencies operating $30 billion of drug control programs, the role of a central coordinating office is imperative. ONDCP is currently operating under an expired authorization, yet they continue to receive annual appropriations from Congress. It's our responsibility as the authorizing committee for the office to provide clearly defined expectations and requirements under which Congress expects the office to operate. 2 weeks ago, our committee released a discussion draft of legislation to reauthorize ONDCP and implement recommendations included in the President's Commission on Combating Drug Addiction and the Opioid Crisis. Over the last 2 weeks, the committee held roundtable discussions with officials from ONDCP, a hearing with ONDCP stakeholders, and collected feedback from states, localities, stakeholders, and individuals nationwide. And yesterday, the committee introduced bipartisan legislation the Coordinated Response through Interagency Strategy and Information Sharing Act, also known as the Crisis Act. This bill reauthorizes the office under a new name, the Office of National Drug Control, by requiring the office develop a strategy to implement key recommendations from the President's Opioid Commission. The Crisis Act calls for an immediate and comprehensive response to the opioid epidemic. This legislation also ensures federal resources allocated towards combating the opioid epidemic are met with coordination and strategic planning, which are essential for producing results. Being a responsible steward of taxpayer funds means doing a lot, sometimes with less. Requiring funding and programs be matched with measurable goals and regular assessment of program effectiveness will ensure accountability and transparency. The Crisis Act also enhances the office's authority to coordinate and oversee the National Drug Control Program. By expanding ONDC's role in the budget process, there will be increased transparency when certifying and justifying the sufficiency of requested funds. The bill gives the office a primary role in standardizing data to inform an evidence-based national strategy and provides the office with greater authority for directing implementation of the strategy and respective drug control programs. The bill provides state and local governments with the tools they need to combat this crisis and other drug threats. By knowing what other states are seeing, what efforts are working, and how they can best leverage those resources, states are better able to respond on the ground. Earlier this year, committee staff traveled to South Carolina to hold a roundtable in Greenville, a newly designated HIDTA district. Hearing from HIDTA in Greenville and HIDTA communities all across the nation has reinformed the importance of keeping the HIDTA program under ONDC to ensure state and local law enforcement agencies have an equal partnership with their federal counterparts in managing the programs, a key component behind the program's success. Finally, this bill establishes a process for identifying and addressing emerging threats. It requires ONDC to establish a national action plan as soon as an emerging threat is detected, so we can get ahead of threats before they become crises. We stand at a critical point in our nation's opioid crisis. Our federal government is in desperate need of a coordinated national response because our fellow citizens are in desperate need and, frankly, counting on us to at least get this right. Before I close, I do want to thank each one of the members of this committee on both sides of the aisle and their staffs and their personal offices and the committee staff on both sides, majority and minority, for being able to accomplish something even in a very challenging environment like the one we sometimes find ourselves in. And it's always a risk when you begin to mention certain members with particularity, but it's a risk that I'm going to have to run today because I want to thank Mr. Cummings personally. I want to thank Mr. Conley. I want to thank Chairman Mark Meadows, Gary Palmer, and so many others who worked behind the scenes without fanfare, without any increase in their salaries, despite the increased work. But more than anything, I want to thank the women and men who are not members of Congress, who just wanted to dedicate their lives to public service. If you ever wonder, in this environment we find ourselves in, whether or not it matters, things like what you have accomplished and will accomplish today are proof that public service can still be a noble thing, particularly when you're helping your fellow citizens who are in the throes of a crisis. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the gentleman from Vermont, my friend Mr. Welch.
I want to strike the last word. First of all, thank you, and thank Mr. Cummings and all the people you thanked. I wanted to just engage in a very brief colloquy with you on a separate matter of an amendment that I was intending to offer, but in view of the bipartisan nature of this bill and some questions about the jurisdiction of this committee, I'm not going to offer it. But if I could just speak to it briefly.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate it. One of the aspects of the opioid crisis is enforcement, and we depend on the DEA to do that. There used to be an enforcement, or there still is an enforcement tool called immediate suspension order. In this Congress, with Mr. Marino and me as a co-sponsor, had hearings in the House and in the Senate. The bill was passed unanimously, and it established a standard of reasonable suspicion What happened after, and it was a totally non-controversial bill, and in fact, there's been no indication that as a result of that bill, anything with respect to opioids that shouldn't be going out are going out. Nevertheless, there was a story in the 60 Minutes in the Washington Post raising questions about this and whether it was something that was favorable to pharma and distribution. There's no evidence that that's the case. The Post story had other issues in there that frankly I think did have some merit, the revolving door and the enormous influence that pharma has on other issues, particularly price. But as a result of this, there was concern among many of us, and Chairman Walden, at my request, invited the DEA to come in and ask them, is there any problem with this law? Do you want it repealed or do you want it changed? They said, and they acknowledged that this law did not result in any adverse consequences, but they promised to get back to us with their suggestion as to what should happen. Their recommendation when they got back in response to Chairman Walden's letter was that the law should not be repealed, but they did suggest that the standard be changed to, quote, probable cause, which interestingly enough is a higher standard than what the law that we passed included. I've made a commitment to the DEA to make an effort to have the language they're requesting put into law, and been working with Mr. Marino on that. I had intended, as you know, Mr. Chairman, to offer an amendment here, but in my discussions with you and others, it appears that it may be better for that effort to occur in the Judiciary Committee. And I appreciated the assurance you gave to me that you do what you could as a member of the Judiciary Committee to assist us in that. I just wanted to bring that to the committee's attention because I think there's a mutual desire on the part of all of us who unanimously passed this law to make certain that we don't do anything that interferes with the legitimate rights and mission of the DEA to intercept any illicit opioids. I yield back.
Well, I would tell the gentleman from Vermont publicly what I told him privately. There is not a fair, harder working, more dedicated member of Congress than Peter Welch. And you impressed upon me earlier today how serious you are and how much you desire the consequences that we intended earlier be manifest. And I will work to you as long as I'm on Judiciary. And you're on Energy and Commerce. We've worked together in the past. There's not a working partner that I enjoy more than the gentleman from Vermont, because you are fair, and you're unabashedly progressive, but you are fair. You plead guilty, but you're dedicated to your constituents, and that was manifest in the conversation that we had on the floor earlier today. So with that and our mutual words to one another, you have my assurance. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5925, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Without
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for, without objection. The amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would put in place the changes you and I have discussed and agreed to make part of the underlying ONDCP authorization bill. My understanding is that our staffs have worked out all the details together. My amendment would do 4 things. First, it would ensure that the ONDCP has the resources available to fulfill not only its current responsibilities, but also the new responsibilities required by this bill. Second, my amendment would ensure that ONDCP has access to the data and analysis necessary to assess trends in drug use and supply, identify threats as they arise, and direct resources to counter these threats and evaluate the effectiveness of the responses. The language would enable the new Emerging Threats Committee to request specific data and analyses from the Fusion Center created by the bill. Third, my amendment would ensure that the emerging threat response plans required by the bill include provisions to expand the availability and effectiveness of evidence-based treatment and prevention programs. As I've said repeatedly, we cannot solve this drug crisis without adequate and effective treatment. My amendment would ensure that our efforts to respond to the emerging threats include the need to provide that treatment. Finally, my amendment would require ONDCP to an advisory committee to promulgate model standards for treatment programs and recovery facilities. One of the most critical threats we face in the proliferation of so-called treatment programs that do not provide effective treatment and that can even aggravate use disorders. Too many treatment programs in this nation exist outside the mainstream medical system, and I've seen a number of them in my own district. In fact, in some states, people with little or no training essentially can offer treatment in their garages and take private pay patients with little state or federal oversight. To begin the process of eliminating these fly-by-night operations, my amendment would require ONDCP to set up an advisory committee to develop and disseminate standards that states could adopt in order to license treatment providers, specify the credentials that treatment professionals must have, and ensure that patients have access to medication-assisted treatment. Although my amendment would require only model standards, I believe this is an important step to help states weed out unscrupulous and ineffective operators. I truly appreciate the willingness of Chairman Gowdy, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Connolly to work with me on these critical provisions. And again, I say to the staff, you know, a lot of times you don't go to a crisis. The crisis comes to you. And I do believe deep in my heart that this is a moment where we are taking a step. We've got more steps to take. But you all have worked so hard to bring us to a point where somebody is going to be helped. Some mother's going to be able to come back to her children and take care of her family. Some father now will be able to walk his daughter down the aisle. And there'll be folks who will not have their child lying to them because they are addicted to drugs and harming them, as I've seen in many, as a trial lawyer, and in many instances in my own district. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. I'll recognize myself very briefly. I want to thank the ranking member from Maryland for his very thoughtful, meritorious amendments that he is offering that add value to the underlying bill. And I recommend to my colleagues that they wholeheartedly accept these amendments proposed. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is on favorably reporting. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Does any other member wish to be heard? For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5925, offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would strengthen provisions in this bill related to the development of the National Drug Control Strategy to help ensure that either the President issues a strategy to guide our efforts to address our nation's drug crisis, or the administration explains to Congress, and specifically this committee, as well as the American people, why such a strategy is not being issued. Currently, we are facing a public health emergency The opioid epidemic is taking 115 American lives every single day. At our hearing last week, we heard a warning that we must expect this crisis to get worse before it gets better. And that's why it's so appalling that 16 months after taking office, President Trump still has failed to produce a national drug control strategy. Now, I don't question that he wants to do it. I don't question his motivation or what's in his heart. I'm just saying it hasn't happened. And we're losing 115 kids, and some not kids, each and every day. But we don't have a coherent strategy besides the goodwill that is shared by members of this committee across the aisle and members of this entire Congress, House and Senate. We had a very good funding bill that was approved about a month ago, $3.4 billion to try to tackle this problem, but it has to be in pursuit of a larger and more coherent strategy. So the resources have been authorized, but there's no plan. Under the last authorizing statute, the President was required to submit a drug control strategy by February of each year. So last February passed, then this February passed, yet we still have no strategy. That is simply inexcusable under the circumstances. We in Congress need to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and my amendment would accomplish that. Under this amendment, if the President fails to submit a national drug policy strategy for a third year in a row, the President must notify Congress and explain why the strategy was not produced, and then tell us when the strategy will be completed. My amendment would also require that if the President fails to issue a strategy by the deadline, the Director of ONDCP, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, or a White House official designated by the President, must appear before this committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee to explain why a strategy has not been produced. In 2016, nearly 64,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. 64,000. We lost 58,000 Americans in Vietnam over a 20-year period. We've lost more than that in 2016 from overdoses. And each and every one of our districts, people are suffering. It's time for the Trump administration to do its job, and it's time for us in Congress to start demanding accountability from the Trump administration. My amendment does exactly that, and I ask that my colleagues join me in supporting this amendment. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Alabama seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts, offered by Mr. Palmer of Alabama.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend you and the ranking member Cummings and Mr. Lynch for his amendment. I think this is some of the most important work that this committee has done and that this Congress is going to do. I take very seriously what we're doing here, and as the ranking member Cummings said, we all have stories that we could share of the terrible toll that is being taken on this nation because of opioid overdose deaths. I sat in the kitchen with a couple who were on my board of directors before I became a member of Congress while the coroner brought their son's body down from his bedroom. And we need to do all that we can to stop this. You also said something, Mr. Chairman, that drugs don't respect territorial boundaries. I just want to point out that this bill is a critical step toward dealing with this problem, but we've also got to secure our borders. Fentanyl has become the deadliest drug out there. Senator Claire McCaskill issued a report that showed that the amount of fentanyl crossing our southern borders nearly doubled since 2016. They interdicted 1,370 pounds in 2016. That's enough to kill nearly 300 million Americans. So I think part of our effort to deal with this, we have got to secure a border. That said, I agree with the spirit of Mr. Lynch's amendment, and I do believe we need to introduce an element of accountability in the event the office fails to issue the drug control strategy. I'm offering an amendment to Mr. Lynch's amendment to remove the requirement for a hearing. This amendment will continue to require the President to notify Congress, and if he does not provide the strategy, Congress can then choose to take whatever steps are appropriate, including holding a hearing at the time of its choosing. So I urge the members to support my amendment to Mr. Lynch's amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment to the amendment? Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have nothing but enormous respect for the gentleman from Alabama, and he's been working on this issue, and his constituents are equally as harmed as mine and the rest of the members of this committee. This requirement that the director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy appear before this committee is just a layer of accountability that I think is necessary in the bill. We also let the White House send whatever official they feel is equipped to address the questions that we have. And that's our only tool here on this committee on oversight, is to really hold people accountable. You know, my district, you know, I could tell you some stories that'll make your hair stand on end. You know, just young people taking their own lives because we had a suicide cluster that had a lot to do with OxyContin and heroin in my district. We lost 14 young boys in a period of about 14 months, 18 months rather. We had to set up a residential substance recovery center for adolescents, for kids, children. I don't think anybody signed up for that. And we reached out to our local labor unions, and we built a place with the support of our health center and one of our local hospitals. So now I got 40 beds, but the line is out the door. 20 beds for young women and 20 beds for young boys. We got to get our arms around this thing. We got to do much better than we've been doing lately on this issue. So I just think that requiring them to come before this committee and answer questions as to why we don't have in this country a coherent and articulated drug policy to guide the resources that we are directing at this crisis, I just think that that's inexcusable. And you know, I like to hold these people's feet to the fire. If this was President Obama doing this, I would be just as adamant that he send someone here to address the questions that our constituents have. Now, I don't consider this amendment a hostile amendment by the gentleman from Alabama, but what I'm trying to get at is to collectively, Democrat and Republican on this committee, to make people do the work that they were expected to do on this problem. As I said before earlier, Congress, Democrat and Republican, on a bill about a month ago, authorized about $3.5 billion to tackle this problem. But you can't just throw money at something without a plan. And we've seen some failures here, and the ranking member has talked about people who are ill-equipped to pursue this policy, and they shouldn't be allowed to take advantage of families and communities that need help. And I think a coherent and powerful drug policy would help us do that. This is a tough problem. It's a tough problem, and it's not going to be solved if we don't have a plan. And you know, right now, because of inaction at the White House, we don't have a plan. And you know, we wanted to have the director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy here last week, and apparently he was invited in some form. There was no formal letter put out, but he didn't show up. And so we couldn't do our job in holding the administration accountable. And that's what this bill would do in its current form. So I understand why the gentleman from Alabama is doing this, but I still think it's more powerful if the President knows that he or his representative is going to be called to account before this committee. I think it's much more likely that it'll happen. But I would not oppose the gentleman's amendment. I understand because of his thoughtfulness and his work on this issue. Again, I don't consider it to be a hostile amendment. I just don't see it as powerful in accomplishing our common purpose. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Massachusetts yield back. The chair will recognize himself and then yield to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer. Gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anyone who has been in these hearings and these markups on this committee, I think, realizes that it's a different atmosphere in this one. You sense the passion and the pain for trying to get this done, and I have tremendous respect for the gentleman from Massachusetts. And you mentioned, we talk about the overdose deaths, but you mentioned something that very few people mention, and that is suicide. And we still have no idea how many of the suicides related to opioid crisis. And I just want to assure the gentleman that with my amendment, which I urge the members to adopt, I am committed to making sure that the administration is held accountable for getting a strategy. I believe the rest of my colleagues would make that same commitment, and that we will insist that there be a coordinated and holistic approach to this in the strategy that's produced. For that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Alabama yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Alabama. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment offered by Mr. Lynch? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mitchell, seek recognition?
I have an amendment to desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5925, offered by Mr. Mitchell of Michigan.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I note that I'm offering this amendment in cooperation with Mr. Raskin. Twice in a matter of 2 days, we agree. Imagine that. This amendment requires the director to establish a tracking system of federally funded initiatives and grant programs, establish performance metrics and goals for grant programs, develop a common application form for drug control-related grant programs, and maintain a comprehensive list of all drug control program grant award opportunities. Imagine that. We actually have to tell them to establish this system. The President's Opioid Commission offered more than 50 recommendations to combat the opioid crisis. The top 3 recommendations address reducing administrative burdens for federal grant recipients, tracking all federally funded initiatives, and review of federally funded programs as required. This amendment incorporates those recommendations by establishing such a system to reduce administrative burdens and have a central database for these programs. I urge the past support for this amendment and will yield time to Mr. Raskin to join me in support.
I want to thank the distinguished gentleman for introducing this, and I'm glad we had the same idea about doing this, and I appreciate your leadership here. When we went to Baltimore, Mr. Chairman, for the hearing with Governor Christie to hear about the Christie recommendations, one of them was that we develop a tracking system so we can actually determine which programs we're putting money into to combat the opioid epidemic are working. And that seems eminently sensible, and it's certainly consistent with everything that I think members on both sides of the aisle have been saying about evidence-based policymaking. We want our policies to follow where the findings and the empirical research show us things are working. And so this builds it right into the legislation, and I want to thank Mr. Mitchell for his leadership on it and for including me in this amendment. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unless folks have questions, I will yield back for sake of brevity and ask support for the amendment.
The gentleman from Michigan yields back. The Chair would like to thank Mr. Mitchell and Professor Raskin for their collaboration on this amendment. Does any other member seek to be recognized? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from California, Mr. DeSaulnier, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman and ranking members, for
Amendment
all-
to
I'm
H.R.
sorry.
5925, offered by Mr. DeSaulnier of California.
My apologies to the gentleman from California. That was my mistake, and now the gentleman is recognized.
My apologies as well, but thank you for your commendable work and words today, along with the ranking member. My amendment would preserve and update a requirement in the existing ONDCP statute that the GAO conduct periodic audits of ONDCP and its programs. As has been said, we are in the midst of the worst public health crisis in 3 decades, and ONDCP has a critically important role to play in addressing this crisis. The office is charged with developing our national drug strategy and with coordinating efforts across the federal government to address the opioid epidemic. The bill we are marking up now gives ONDCP new responsibilities and new authorities to use in combating this epidemic. We need to make sure that ONDCP is effectively carrying out its existing mission as well as these new responsibilities. GAO is an invaluable partner in that effort. With 115 Americans dying every day from opioid overdoses, now is not the time to loosen oversight requirements or make them optional. My understanding, Mr. Chairman, is that we have vetted this amendment with the majority staff to address your concerns. And with that, I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back. I want to thank the gentleman from California for his amendment and for his hard work and his collegiality towards his colleagues. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I support the amendment offered by my colleague, Mr. DeSaulnier. This amendment would make sure that GAO continues to monitor the work of ONDCP and its programs going forward. I understand our staff have discussed this and have no objections to the amendment. GAO is essential in making sure our government operates effectively and efficiently. Given ONDCP's important role in combating the opioid epidemic, it is crucial that GAO continue to exercise robust oversight of the office going forward. It is important that we have accountability. I don't care how you look at it, because that is what will get us the kind of results that we all desire. And with that, I support this amendment and urge the committee to support it.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. If there are no more amendments, does any other member wish to be heard? If there are no more amendments and no recorded votes were requested above, then the question is on favorably reporting H.R. 5925 as amended to the House of Representatives. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Next item for consideration is H.R. 5415, the GAO-IG Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5415, to require agencies to submit reports on outstanding recommendations in the annual budget justification submitted to Congress.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from North Carolina, the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Walker, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Most gracious Chairman, I have amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5415, offered by Mr. Walker of North Carolina.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Government Accountability Office and the Inspector Generals are the two best sources for recommendations to improve federal government operations. GAO and IG efforts help fight waste, fraud, and abuse and promote effective and efficient executive agencies. GAO and IGs conduct audits and investigations, which often result in reports with recommendations directed to a specific agency. As of May 16, 2018, GAO has issued 1,566 products with 4,827 open recommendations, and since 2014, OIGs have issued over 8,900 reports with approximately 40,300 total recommendations. Now, during the same time period, OIG has identified over $99 billion in potential savings through their audits and investigations and associated recommendations. But those recommendations are only as valuable as the agency's commitment to implement them. The GAO-IG Act requires an agency to report on the recommendations from their OIG and GAO within the budget justification to Congress. The agency must also report on the implementation status of each recommendation and why they may have not been implemented fully. This creates a process in which agencies must take stock of their open and unimplemented recommendations. It is my hope that the increased transparency will cause agencies to work toward closing these outstanding recommendations. Congress can also use the new report to improve its oversight activities. This bipartisan legislation will make government better, more accountable, and save taxpayer dollars. I urge my colleagues to support the bill. Yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I support this bill, which would increase the transparency and accountability of federal agencies. The bill would require agencies to include in their budget justifications to Congress a summary of the recommendations made by GAO on the agency's or the agency's Inspector General. Agencies would be required to explain what steps they are taking to address these recommendations, or if they disagree with them and why. GAO and Inspectors General provide critical oversight of the executive branch. Knowing what agencies are doing to address GAO and IG recommendations will assist Congress in conducting its constitutional role of oversight. This is a common sense measure that I support, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 5415 as amended. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The bill is considered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Next item for consideration is H.R. 2648, the Veterans Transition Improvement Act. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 2648, to amend Title 38 United States Code to ensure that the requirements that new federal employees who are veterans with service-connected disabilities are provided leave for purposes of undergoing medical treatment for such disabilities apply to certain employees of the Veterans Health Administration and for other purposes.
Ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2648, offered by Mr. Russell of Oklahoma.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our nation owes a debt of gratitude to our veterans who served our country honorably. In recognition of their military service, Congress has consistently encouraged the executive branch to hire veterans. In fact, in fiscal year 2016, over 30% of total hires in the executive branch were indeed veterans. However, more can be done to recognize the challenges faced by veterans who have service-connected disabilities. In 2015, this committee led the effort to enact the Wounded Warrior Federal Leave Act. This law provides 104 hours of paid sick leave to newly employed veterans at federal agencies who have a service-connected disability rating of 30% or more. The sick leave is used to attend medical treatment related to the service-connected disability and must be used within 12 months of beginning employment. That law, however, did not explicitly apply to veterans hired remarkably by the Department of Veterans Affairs into certain medical occupations. And while the VA has admirably applied the provisions of the Act to these occupations, what this amendment does is ensure that the new veterans that are hired in these positions continue to receive paid sick leave to treat their disability. And I urge my colleagues to support. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I thank Representative Stivers and Takano for their sponsorship of this much-needed bipartisan bill. I also thank Representative Russell for offering a substitute amendment that would improve the underlying bill. The amendment would expand coverage of Representative Lynch's Wounded Warriors Federal Leave Act to newly hired health care professionals at the Veterans Health Administration. Representative Russell and the sponsors of this measure recognize that about 1/3 of the VA's new hires are veterans. It is no surprise that veterans who leave military service want to continue to serve this country and the American people. We are grateful that these brave men and women, many of whom are wounded themselves, chose to devote their civilian careers to taking care of their fellow wounded warriors. This amendment would provide newly hired nurses, doctors, physician assistants, dentists, optometrists, chiropractors, and at the VAHA who have service-connected disabilities with 104 hours of leave during their first year of employment to take care of their medical conditions. I urge my colleagues to support this very thoughtful and important bill and the amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you and I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to thank Representative Steve Stivers for his sponsorship of this bill. He's done an awful lot of hard work, and it's been my privilege to present it here.
Gentleman from Oklahoma yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 2648 as amended. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The next item for consideration is the TLDR Act of 2018. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5321, to improve communication from federal agencies to individuals by requiring clear instructions and for other purposes.
Clerk is correct. It is H.R. 5321. That was my oversight, but I ask unanimous consent nonetheless that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point without objection so ordered. It's my understanding the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Giaforte, will offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the bill. The gentleman is recognized to call up his amendment.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 5321, offered by Mr. Gianforte of Montana.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Montana is recognized for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill and his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Often, federal agency communications with the public are confusing and replete with arcane bureaucratic burdens. A recent study found that the federal government has the worst image of any business or industry sector in the country. One way we can improve our constituents' interactions with the government is by clarifying agency communications. For example, some Americans may face difficulty when seeking assistance or aid through federal programs. A constituent of this bill's sponsor, Representative Moulton, recently received correspondence from the Department of Veterans Affairs. The letter provided the constituent with directions on how to access his benefits. When reviewing the letter, the constituent almost missed important information in the letter. Had he not caught this vital information, the constituent would have likely been delayed in receiving his benefits. To ensure individuals are not missing important details in government correspondence, agency communication needs to be clear. That is what this bill is about. The federal government communicating with the public more clearly and efficiently. The Too Long Didn't Read Act requires agencies to spell out any required actionable steps for constituents on the front page of any agency communication. This bill also requires this clearly marked section at the top of the agency correspondence to list additional pertinent details, such as how to complete the action, any applicable deadlines, and agency contact information. Many Americans rely on government for essential benefits or services. They should not be contingent on deciphering confusing government correspondence. By requiring agencies to simplify their communications with the public, we are improving the government's interaction with the American people. This bill ensures transparency and accountability for our constituents. I'd like to thank Representative Moulton and Representative Meadows for working in a bipartisan manner on this issue. I urge my colleagues on this committee to support H.R. 5321, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Montana yields back. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I support this bill, which was introduced by Representative Seth Moulton. This bill would require an agency, when it sends a communication to an individual requiring or authorizing the individual to take an action, to include a clear statement at the top of the communication explaining exactly what is required. The bill would require agencies to provide contact information for the agency. This bill would help clarify what actions taxpayers, recipients of federal benefits, and other individuals who receive letters from the government must take. This is a straightforward bipartisan bill, and I support it. That I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard? The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized. Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A 2017 Gallup study found the federal government has the worst image of any business or industry sector in the country, as we just recently heard. That same study also found more than 1 in 5 adults cite dissatisfaction with political leadership and the government as one of the most important problems in our country. 2015 Pew Research study found only 20% of respondents would describe government programs as being well-run. Likewise, the public's trust in the federal government remains low. One way for the federal government to improve its relationship with the public is by improving the customer experience. For example, the government correspondence to individuals can be very confusing. For example, a veteran in Massachusetts received a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs that included instructions on how he could access his benefits. But that individual nearly missed an important detail buried in the lengthy letter. Had he not caught the detail, he would have been delayed in receiving his very benefits. To ensure individuals are not missing important details in government correspondence, agencies' communications need to be clear. That clarity is crucial. H.R. 5321 directs the Office of Management and Budget to require agencies to clearly note important information and instructions on the top page of their communication. The The bill applies to hard copy and electronic agency communications when the communication requires the recipient to take action. This clearly marked section on the top of agency correspondence includes whether a response to the agency is required and the action the individual needs to take. The section also includes any deadlines, plus directions for how the individual should complete the action and agency contact information. The amendment in the nature of a substitute actually amends the Plain Writing Act of 2010. The Plain Writing Act requires federal agencies to use clear and concise communications the public can understand and use. The Plain Writing Act also requires agencies to use plain writing in government documents. This bill and ANS will further ensure that federal agencies are clearly communicating with the public to simplify interactions within the government. And again, I would certainly strongly recommend my colleagues to support this bill. And with that, I will...
Is the gentleman open for a colloquy?
Yes.
I believe this is a bill that was brought to our attention by our colleague and friend, Mr. Meadows, and also the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton. Is that right?
I believe that is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Meadows is a member of our committee, but Mr. Moulton is not. But I want to take a moment and ask my friends on the other side of the aisle. In fact, I'll ask my friend, Professor Raskin. Make sure you let Seth know how much we appreciate this and a thoughtful bill. And what a wonderful colleague he is, and thank him for his previous service to our country in uniform also. So with that, the gentleman from North Carolina, do you yield back?
I do yield back.
Gentleman back. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Question is now on favorably reporting H.R. 5321 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Next item for consideration is H.R. 5896, the Border Patrol Pay Reform Amendments Act of 2018. For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I seek, Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition for a motion.
The gentlelady will state her motion.
Okay, at our committee's business meeting last November, Democrats asked for our committee to be allowed to debate and vote on 6 subpoena motions covering multiple agencies and issues. In each case, we had already written letters explaining our request. In each case, the chairman declined to issue a subpoena by himself. And in each case, we asked for all committee members to have the opportunity to vote on these motions for themselves, which is allowed under our rules, but our motion was ruled out of order. Then again, at our business meeting in February, we asked for our committee to be allowed to debate and vote on 13 additional motions for subpoenas, again to a wide variety of agencies and entities that are withholding documents in response to our requests. Again, our request was blocked. Again, at our business meeting in March, we asked for our committee to be allowed to debate and vote on 13 new subpoena motions, again to multiple federal agencies, offices, and entities that are withholding documents in response to requests from members of this committee. And again, our motion was blocked. And since our markup in March, we have sent 12 more letters to the chairman explaining in detail our requests for 12 additional subpoenas. And in each case, the Trump administration and others are refusing to produce any documents or testimony. Ranking Member Cummings summarized each one of these requests in a letter to the chairman on Monday, and I would like to ask unanimous consent to place that letter in the record.
Without objection.
And our 12 current subpoena motions span a wide variety of topics, from the Trump administration's sudden decision to add an untested, new citizenship question to the census, to the State Department's political cleaning out of career employees, to the White House staff use of private chartered planes. The White House, 6 federal agencies and private entities, including Cambridge Analytica, have all refused to produce documents. And, Mr. Chairman, the last time Democrats made this motion, you denied it, but you also promised to take action. You scheduled several meetings with the White House and government agencies, but predictably, none of these meetings resulted in a single document being produced. We still do not have the documents, and you still have not issued a single subpoena as chairman of this important oversight committee, even for investigations that were bipartisan. Our rules grant us the authority as a committee to vote on a motion to subpoena these documents, but you have consistently refused to let our committee do so. All we are asking is that you let our committee perform our role under the Constitution. We understand you do not want to issue subpoenas to the Trump administration yourself, but let us take a vote as a committee. And for all of these reasons, I hereby move that this committee authorize and issue subpoenas for documents and testimony on the 12 topics as described in Ranking Member Cummings' letter to the chairman on Monday. The motion is at the clerk's desk, and we will continue to press. That's it.
The gentlelady from New York has offered a motion for a subpoena. The motion is improper as the item is not on the agenda. With that,
Well,
the next item for consideration
We'll
is,
continue pushing. Thank you.
next item for
Not over till it's
consideration,
over, as Yogi says.
next item for consideration is H.R. 5896, the Border Patrol Act Reform Amendments Act of the Border Patrol Pay Reform Amendments Act of 2018. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5896 to amend Title V United States Code to modify the authority for pay and work schedules of Border Patrol agents and for other purposes.
I ask unanimous consent the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Hurd, for 5 minutes for a statement on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this bipartisan piece of legislation. I don't care which side of the aisle you're on. There's no debating that our Border Patrol agents are selfless and play a vital role in our national security. And as a member of Congress who represents a district that has 800 miles of the southern border, more than any member of Congress, I'm all too aware of the day-to-day obstacles our Border Patrol agents have to face. Now, as a result of bureaucratic inefficiencies, many Border Patrol agents were not receiving the pay they had rightfully earned, and in some cases were being forced to work dangerously long shifts to make up for the onerous and arcane regulations handed down to them from OPM. The purpose of this Border Patrol Agent Pay Reform Amendment Act of 2018 is to fix this broken system and make sure our agents receive the pay they've earned. I appreciate the willingness of the Customs and Border Protection, the Office of Personnel Management, and the Border Patrol Council to sit down and work toward an agreement on these most pressing issues plaguing our courageous Border Patrol agents. I strongly urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I support the gentleman's bill.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5896 offered by Mr. Hurd of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. I would, just for housekeeping matters, let my colleagues know I am aware the votes have been called.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be short. This amendment fixes two technical reference issues in the bill. It inserts guidance on alternative work schedules for agents at Level 2 and basic rates of pay to conform with current law. This also clarifies OPM has the authority to regulate the Border Patrol Agent Pay Reform Act. We got some additional requested changes from OPM and CBP late yesterday afternoon, and this amendment incorporates the changes that we were able to work through and will continue to work through with OPM and CBP. I just want to make sure everybody knows that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency, OPM, and the National Border Patrol Council supports and are agreeable to these changes. So it's simple changes like limits Sunday and holiday premium paid 8 hours, which is standard limit under current law. It clarifies how do you interpret references to a day or work day and leave-related laws in terms of hours. So these are some technical fixes that we got this feedback from OPM, and I yield back. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Does any other member wish to be heard on this amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Does any other member wish to be heard? If not, the question is on reporting H.R. 5896 as amended. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to previous order, the chair declares the committee in recess subject to the call of the chair. We'll consult with the minority to provide adequate notice to members when we reconvene. I would let all members know there is one more matter on the agenda, and your attendance is welcome after votes. With that, we stand in recess. committee will come to order. Pursuant to notice, next item for consideration is the adverse reporting of House Resolution 877. The clerk will designate the resolution.
House Resolution 877 of inquiry directing the Secretary of Commerce to provide certain documents in the Secretary's possession to the House of Representatives relating to the decision to include a question on citizenship in the 2020 decennial census of population.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes, but I won't take the full 5 minutes. The Department of Commerce has told this committee multiple times they will provide documents to this committee in conjunction with court filings that are due early next month. So as I just told my friend from California, I certainly understand the desire for documents to inform and instruct decision-making and to better understand decisions that have been made in the past. Having documents in many instances is the foundation from which you're able to frame questions. And I know that so well because I've lived it for first 6 years I was in Congress. The pursuit of documents from executive branch entities. So I understand the reason for it. The explanation I also understand, which is that they're in litigation. And while we're a branch of government that from time to time is given different explanations, whether it's a privilege, whether it's an ongoing IG investigation, whether in this case it is ongoing litigation, it just strikes me that waiting until June the 8th is a fairly small accommodation, given the fact that they have assured us multiple times the information will be made available. So with that, I appreciate the gentleman from California, appreciate our conversation on the floor, appreciate the desire to have documents. If we don't have them contemporaneous with the court filing, I'll be the biggest cheerleader you have. But I do understand the desire to not let other things impact ongoing litigation, particularly the fact that we're talking about a couple of weeks. With that, I'll recognize the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I strongly support this resolution as introduced, and I am deeply disappointed that it has become necessary. I want to thank Representative Gomez for his steadfast, very hard work on this issue to protect the integrity of the census and the responsibility we all are charged with under the Constitution to count every person in this country. The census is supposed to be a nonpartisan endeavor conducted by experts with the goal of achieving the most accurate count possible. Adding a new untested question about citizenship would discourage certain residents from responding, increase costs to the American taxpayers, and result in an inaccurate count. The Trump administration stated rationale for adding this question, that they want to protect the rights of voters in our country and need this new data to do it. It's very difficult to believe. The Trump administration's record on voting rights goes exactly in the opposite direction. The most prominent voting rights groups in the country say the Trump administration's rationale for needing this citizenship question is simply, and I quote, false. When the Secretary of Commerce announced the new citizenship question earlier this year, he conceded that the Census Bureau's own experts raised concerns that it was going to reduce response rates, and 6 former census directors agreed. So Democrats have been trying to get basic information on the issue from Secretary Ross. We requested documents from the experts inside the Census Bureau who raised the concerns about this question, but the Trump administration refuses to produce them. We sent a letter asking you, Mr. Chairman, to subpoena these documents so we could review them, but you did not respond, and I'm glad to hear you say what you said today, and that is that as soon as the litigation, we pass that litigation issue, we can get them. I'm pleased to hear that, and I believe you. We sent a letter to the Justice Department asking for information on its rationale for requesting that this question be included in the census. And we got no response. We again asked the chairman to subpoena DOJ, again to no avail. Finally, we tried to subpoena the DOJ witness at last week's hearing after he refused to answer questions under oath. But the majority voted down this motion with absolutely no explanation. So we've come to this point, offering a resolution of inquiry to get answers to questions that every member of this committee should want if they are truly concerned with protecting the integrity of the upcoming census. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. Does any other member seek to be heard? Gentleman from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The way this question is being treated by the minority in the media, you would think the United States is the only country to ask people about their citizenship status. At the May 8th hearing, Mr. Comstock from the Department of Commerce testified that even the United Nations recommends to all members that they ask questions on citizenship. This recommendation is followed by Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Indonesia, Ireland, Mexico, Spain, and the United Kingdom, amongst others. So this is not unusual. I generally take a dim view of the United Nations, but I looked at the recommendation there as statistically important reason to ask about citizenship. And lest my colleagues think that this is an out-of-date recommendation, the document from the United Nations is dated 2017. Now, if the United Nations and I are agreeing, not only has somewhere hot frozen over, but a citizenship question on this census form must be appropriate. Moreover, the citizenship question is relevant for apportionment purposes. I've stated this in a previous hearing, Mr. Chairman, making this point that states and localities that declare themselves sanctuary states, it should be evident that those locality populations would increase by virtue of an influx of people coming into the country illegally. Those people should be counted for enumeration purposes, but it is essential to know who is a citizen, who is here legally, and who is not, to have an apportionment count that does not harm other states. I urge the committee to report the resolution unfavorably.
The gentleman from Alabama yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Equal representation, it's why our country conducts a census. It ensures that all of us, regardless of our socioeconomic backgrounds, political philosophies, citizenship status, or the languages we speak, are well represented. And as members of Congress, we have a constitutional obligation to oversee this vital process. We have been charged with the task of making sure the census is conducted in a fair and accurate manner. And it is with this solemn responsibility in mind that I filed this resolution of inquiry. The Trump administration's attack on the census go far beyond politics. They represent a major assault on our representative democracy. Democrats on this committee have repeatedly asked the U.S. Census Bureau, Commerce, and Justice Department for documents and communications detailing the administration's last-minute decision to add the citizenship question. To date, we have not received a response. In fact, the administration has gone so far as to suggest it won't respond to any of our questions. Just last week, Democrats on the committee questioned Acting Assistant Attorney General John Gore on the Justice Department's reasoning for adding the citizenship question. Mr. Gore refused to answer. What's worse, he looked us straight in the eye and lied, saying it was a longstanding policy to decline to make statements about such matters because of ongoing litigation. I know I haven't been here very long, but I have no trouble recognizing when a witness before this committee is playing games. And that's what Mr. Gore did last week and the week before. It was unprecedented. And we know Mr. Gore was lying because my colleague, Mr. Connolly, raised the precedent set by this committee during the Fast and Furious investigation. During that investigation, this committee received many documents from the Obama Justice Department despite ongoing litigation. Yet, this administration has done nothing and absolutely nothing but trample on our constitutional authority to conduct oversight. Chairman Gowdy summed up our collective frustration when he asked Mr. Gore if a citizenship question would help the Justice Department enforce the Voting Rights Act or if it was included because they felt like it. It is in this very same spirit that we've tried to conduct oversight on this administration and their motives behind adding a citizenship question. Was it a data-driven move, or was it simply because they felt like it? The members of this committee have a right to know. The American people have a right to know. We know a citizenship question will depress response rates. Secretary Ross even acknowledged it when he testified before this committee last year. And if he knew it would compromise the census, why would he add the question? Who else at Commerce helped him make that decision? Who at the DOJ took part in that decision? Was Stephen Miller involved in the decision-making? Chris Kobach, President Trump himself? These aren't unreasonable questions, and yet they remain unanswered. They remain unanswered because this administration refuses to be transparent with our constituents and the American people. That is why we need these documents. This is why I filed this resolution of inquiry. So I ask my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for their support, because a vote to block this resolution of inquiry from reaching the floor is a vote to abandon our responsibility to protect a strong, nonpartisan census. It'll be a vote to silence the voices of others who deserve to be heard, and it is a vote to ignore our constitutional duty to keep this administration in check. I don't believe anybody here believes that too much power hasn't flown to the executive. I think that we have to start saying when is the time to start bringing back some of our constitutional authority to keep the executive in check. It might be small, it might be big, but it is worthwhile to start taking that step together. So I yield back.
The gentleman from California yields back. We'll now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina and then the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman from California for his remarks in terms of the power of the executive branch. Obviously, it has been well reported about my desire to get documents from the Department of Justice. And yet, today, this resolution creates a conflict that, quite frankly, doesn't need to be raised at this particular point. I think the ranking member would acknowledge that my word to him on this particular subject, not only with a briefing, but also with a May 8th hearing, not only did I make that commitment, but I followed through on that commitment. And when there can be many times a lot of pressure to, for one political reason or another, to actually opine on these particular issues, I've been good to my word on this particular subject, and I think most on your side of the aisle would agree with that. I think this slight accommodation that we're asking for is not to diminish the arguments that you just made, and I don't intend to do that. But I also believe that to jump to this kind of position this quickly really defies who we are as a body in terms of giving reasonable accommodations. The census, the 2020 census, will not happen for over 2 years. And at this, if we cannot accommodate for just a few weeks, I just find that troubling. So I humbly and respectfully ask the gentleman from California to withdraw his resolution with a commitment from this member that I will work very diligently with the chairman and the ranking member to assure that we do get those documents, because no one in this body or on this committee has been stonewalled more by the Department of Justice than I have on a different issue. And so I can relate, and I will not tolerate it for your side nor my side, regardless of the administration. So I humbly ask you to, with the gentleman withdraw his resolution, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the chair. And I've listened carefully to my friends from North Carolina and Alabama, and they know I respect them both. The resolution Mr. Gomez has thoughtfully put before us is not, however, as Mr. Palmer has framed it, a question of whether this is a simple question that everybody ought to know, and they're asking it in Ireland. This is a question of whether this committee, the Oversight Committee, is entitled to see supporting documents for what led to the addition of this question after decades of it not being asked on the census. Because we want, all of us, I think, to know, could such a question, even if ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, there's nothing wrong with the question per se, its impact on a census that already struggles for cooperation. If the intent here is in fact to discourage minority participation, that is enormously consequential. By the way, for Republicans and Democrats, in terms of representation in this body, in terms of the allocation of federal resources in our respective districts. It ought not to be a partisan issue, and I appreciate what Mr. Meadows has just said, because I have heard him say he shares the underlying view that we're entitled to, we need to see the documents in question. This committee, on which I've sat for 10 years, would have put the Spanish Inquisition to shame with the zeal in which subpoenas and investigations were launched on often relatively marginal issues. But today we want to buy time. We want to give the administration an opportunity. Now, I might have been willing to go along with that, but for, as Mr. Gomez points out, the lack of testimony of Mr. Gore last week, who flat out refused to answer questions with respect to this question being added to the census. And I would say to my friends on the other side of the aisle, not for 1 minute would you have tolerated that non-response from the Obama administration. But today, it's different. And sadly, what's different is a different party is represented in the Oval Office. And we're willing to hang up our oversight spurs rather than risk any disfavor from that White House. And that, to me, is a sad day for this committee. So if I'm going to support Mr. Gomez's resolution because I think it's an important function of the Congress. I don't think we have anything to fear from this resolution. In fact, the documentation may very well reassure my friends on the other side of the aisle and disconcert us in how it arrived at the decision. But we don't know that without seeing the documents. And if the documents aren't going to be provided and haven't been provided voluntarily, this committee should do what it did previously, compel them. I yield back.
Gentleman from Virginia yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given the level of attention that some have paid to this question, you would think it's the only issue at the census requiring robust oversight. I can tell you this could not be further from the truth. The Census Bureau is completely revamping how it conducts the 2020 census and how the public interacts with the census. We all know for the first time the 2020 census will give people the ability to answer online. You would think a simple questionnaire website would be pretty easy. I mean, most of us have all used SurveyMonkey at some point. Well, maybe not my mom. But nevertheless, to get a simple website up and running, the Census Bureau has completely revamped its online IT infrastructure. Unfortunately, development of critical IT systems are still underway and needs the oversight of this committee to ensure a successful completion. The 2020 census is also expanding the use of administrative records and address canvassing. And finally, no one at the Census Bureau seems to know how much the 2020 census will cost. Past lifestyle cost estimates from the Bureau have been flat wrong. Even more concerning, cost assumptions were not supported by any evidence. The fiscal year 2018 Appropriations Omnibus Bill appropriated $2.8 billion to the census. This is well above the administration's request. An FY 219 Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill also would appropriate even more to the 2020 census. Maybe this money is needed, but it should not be squandered by unwise spending decisions. Sadly, this resolution of inquiry only distracts from these very serious challenges, and I urge the committee to report the resolution unfavorable. With that, I yield back, Chair.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentlelady from the District of Columbia is recognized.
I thank the Chairman for recognizing me, and I want to say that I don't doubt the good faith of the chair of the committee and of the subcommittee. That's really not at issue here. I think, indeed, I invite them to go on the record with us because I don't think they mean to deny us this material, but they don't control the material. So this resolution sends a message, and I'd love it to be a bipartisan message, particularly given what the chairs of the committee and the ranking have and the subcommittee have said, that this would put to rest some of the concern about the census. I am so concerned that I have introduced a bill to prohibit the census from including this question on the census. I've got about a dozen co-sponsors now, and I wonder if my friends on the other side understand that this question could penalize their constituents as well. The census just counts who's here. It counts it for purposes of resources. And if you want your resources counted, then don't count some of the people who are in the country that you wish were not here, but are here and are using resources. So you're punishing everybody if, in fact, everybody is not counted. Now, you got to ask yourself, why hasn't this question been on the census for 70 years? And there's a good reason. Because, yes, it is important to know about citizenship, and that's why the American Community Survey has found a statistically accurate way to ask or find out about citizenship. Why isn't that enough for my friends who are insisting that this question hit people in the face? It's going to hit people in the face who are legally in this country, and they're going to say, all the rhetoric I've heard during the last few years means I'm not going to answer this question. I don't have any idea what this will mean. In fact, by not including this question, it doesn't mean that when people refuse to answer, the census says, that's it. There's going to be increased costs for non-response follow-up. And then you've got on the record the officials of the census saying, and to quote Mr. Goldenkopf, the Director of Strategic Issues before the House Appropriations Committee, that there are, quote, risks associated with late changes of any nature, and that's what we're talking about here, of any nature to the design of the census if the Bureau is unable to test those changes under operational conditions. They will not be tested under operational conditions here, and of course, there was earlier testimony from officials at the Census Bureau who, quote, expressed concern that adding this question could reduce the accuracy of the decennial census and increase costs for non-response follow-up. Given that testimony, given what we now know on the record, this resolution is a no-cost resolution. At best, it could be redundant if, in fact, the chair is able to get a prompt response from the administration. He said he doesn't have any difficulty with such a response. So I would invite my good friends on the other side to join with us so that the message is clear that there is no objection to the administration making sure that this committee gets the information requested. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from the District of Columbia yields back. The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to the United States Census Bureau, the purpose of the census is to determine the numbers of people living in the United States and empower the people to determine their representation. Who determines representation? Citizens or non-citizens? It's citizens. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States. Most of us think that that was a good idea. The 15th Amendment provides, quote, the right of citizens of the United States to vote, and they shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That was a good idea also. And then if you look at the Voting Rights Act, in the 1960s, it applied to citizens, and it prohibited test or abridgment to uphold the 14th and 15th Amendments. Would upholding the right of citizens to vote and be properly represented be wrong? Not according to the Constitution. Would not protecting citizens' rights to vote be an abridgment? It most certainly would. Questions beyond name and basic data have been upheld repeatedly in the courts in the United States as far back as time of our nation. The United States versus Moriarty in 1901 upheld that the Constitution's Census Clause, quote, does not prohibit the gathering of other statistics, and if necessary and proper, for the intelligent exercise of other powers enumerated in the Constitution, and in such case there could be no objection, interesting, no objection, to acquiring this information through the same machinery by which the population is enumerated. Mr. Chairman, the most concerning part of this whole debate is the questioning that citizenship is somehow not a core component of the Voting Rights Act. If you don't believe me, you can believe Title 52 of the United States Code, which says, quote, no voting qualification or prerequisite to voting or standard, practice, or procedure shall be imposed or applied by any state or political subdivision in a manner which results in a denial or abridgment of the right of any citizen of the United States to vote on account of race or color or in the contravention of the guarantees set forth in section. In our representative republic, the right of citizens to vote is the most important part of equality and civil rights. It's not just about resources. If it were, whether you mark citizen or non-citizen will not affect the resources. But it does matter how it's marked in terms of representation. The Constitution is clear. We can cite convenience. We can make an argument about people answering or not answering. All of that is irrelevant because the Constitution is quite clear in its purpose for having census in the first place. We, as duly elected representatives, draw our consent to government, we draw our power from the consent of the people. But those people, in every document that we've ever had and in the court cases in the past, to include the Voting Rights Act, of which so many seem to be concerned as being abridged, defines citizens. Citizenship is a qualification for voting and is therefore a criterion to enforce the Voting Rights Act. And I urge the committee to report the resolution unfavorably.
Would my friend yield?
Unfortunately, I have.
You got a minute.
I will to my colleague, if it's for a question.
Friend from, yes, about the Voting Rights Act. I found it so interesting that you went to the Voting Rights Act and we talk about.
And the 14th and 15th Amendments.
And you mentioned that the state should not abridge someone's access to the ballot box and the right to vote. But when we go through this debate about photo ID, that is an abridgment. Now, I don't know how many.
What is your question?
The question is, how many cases can you cite of people that are not citizens trying to vote?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Reclaiming my time, to quote Mr. Gore in the hearing we just had, he said, in 2016, nearly 9 million Texans voted, and there was no suggestion and no evidence brought to the court that the voter ID law had resulted in any vote of suppression. 3 weeks ago, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed that the law was sufficient to remedy the defects, and it overturned the judgment of the district court.
No,
unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, I am
My
out of
question
time,
is,
and I
how
yield back.
many non-citizens tried to vote?
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the gentlelady from New York.
I want to thank you for recognizing, Mr. Chairman, and for your sincerity, and Mr. Meadows and others to get this information. And we are supporting you on it. And what's important about this resolution is that it literally has a time frame that the information has to be given. I think it's an important resolution. And after all, we are the Oversight Committee. And some of us have written our own requests for information. I've done my own. Mr. Cummings has done his own letters and then letters on behalf of the committee. All of us have been writing letters and asking for information, and we haven't been getting it. So that's one of the reasons this would demand that this information be given, and I think it's important, and it's our job. We owe it to the American people to do our jobs to conduct oversight and get to the bottom of this decision-making process that will have, according to professionals, a profound effect on our nation's impact on getting an accurate census. We know that no one at the Census Bureau that are professionals or career people that are dedicated to getting an accurate count made this suggestion. And there are many people are suggesting or saying that it was a partisan political operative and decision. I don't know. That's why we're asking for this information. But what was very disturbing to me was a recent interview by Mr. Mark Brunel, the failed pick for both the director and deputy director of the Census Bureau, where he admitted in his own words that this question was a political decision, quote, that would drive down the count. Now, I don't think anyone on the other side of the aisle wants to drive down the count, but apparently someone does. There was also news reports that I read that the RNC or the Trump administration, not the Trump administration, the Trump political campaign, was literally fundraising off this. Like it was a political achievement to have this added, so they were saying, give us more money. Literally, I think we should try to find that fundraising appeal and put it into the record. And so that there's so many things. I mean, why are you fundraising that I'm going to help you get a Republican majority after I put this question on? And there's a lot of, we already have this information. You know, in 1965, we passed the Voting Rights Act, and this question has never been asked. It has been part of the American survey. It's never been part of it. None of the civil rights or voting rights professionals say that it's needed. They say it's not needed for enforcing the voting rights in any way, shape, or form. But what's being alleged is that it's being used to drive down the count of people in America. Now, if you read the Constitution, which my colleague was doing, the Constitution only has, I believe, one direct demand of the executive, and they spell it right out in there that they have to conduct this census review every 10 years, and that it has to be a count of everyone in America. That's what the language says. That means everyone, and that's what we're trying to do to get an accurate count that is based on this count. Not only is our data based on it for businesses to project what is needed, where hospitals are needed, where schools are needed. If our data is not right, then our planning and programming is not right. So this is an important thing to support. So I'm supporting Mr. Gomez. He's been very intent on trying to get this information. So have I. A lot of us have been trying to get this information. And what was so upsetting to me was when we had Mr. Gore here and we asked about all this information. Not only did he not answer anything, but he said that there was ongoing litigation, therefore he couldn't answer it. But I mean, we conduct oversight against here with many people, the IRS investigation. That was ongoing litigation. That didn't bother the Republican majority to haul in all the officials from the IRS and ask them what was going on. We're the Oversight Committee, and we conduct parallel investigations all the time. And we're entitled to this information surrounding a decision that will seriously affect the lives and representation of the American people. Now, statisticians, scientists, career professionals that conduct census, they are saying that this will result in a undercount. So, and so I think we need to get to the bottom, and even the statements by some of your people that you wanted to appoint to the Census Bureau are saying that. And I would say that Mr. Gore insulted this committee by failing to show up on May 8th. And when we moved to subpoena him, you graciously, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, recessed the hearing saying that you would get him before the committee, either voluntarily or by subpoena. And to your credit, you got him before the committee, but then he refused to say anything. So the next step is a subpoena. So that's what we're asking for, and I think that we must approve Mr. Gomez's resolution of inquiry, and we're running out of chances to do that and be right by the American people. Yes, Mr. Chairman?
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentlelady.
Oh, I was just warming up. I have
That's what I was fearful of. That's why I hated to interrupt you.
I
But
yield back. I yield
want to
back.
be a good steward of everyone's time because it's getting close to dinner. The gentleman from Georgia and then the gentlelady from New Jersey, and I have not forgotten about the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to begin with some facts about the citizenship question. This question was last asked on the short form census, which was mailed to everyone from 1890 to 1950. The question was moved at that time to the long form census because there were too many questions on the questionnaire, and this was a period of low immigration. The long form census was mailed every 10 years to roughly 5% of the U.S. population. In 2005, the Census Bureau launched the American Community Survey, which is a rolling survey sent to about 1% of the households every year, about 3.5 million households. In 2010, the long-form census was discontinued and replaced by the American Community Survey. The citizenship question has appeared on every American Community Survey questionnaire since 2005. So as you can see, the citizenship question was and remains a very important statistical question throughout the history of the census. Perhaps the greatest pretense here is my Democrat colleagues don't object to the citizenship question on the American Community Survey. In fact, as Ms. Norton mentioned a while ago, her bill, H.R. 4906, prohibits the citizenship question on the decennial questionnaire, but the same bill from her specifically allows the question to continue to be asked on the American Community Survey. So the objection clearly is not to the question or its wording, but to the number of people now being asked to respond to the question. At the end of the day, there's only one question that the Constitution requires, and that is how many people live in this household. And regrettably, this is a politically motivated resolution that is detracting from the 2020 census. A second point that I'd like to make, Mr. Chairman, and it may be hard for us all to remember, but back in 2009, newly elected President Obama nominated a Republican, Judd Gregg, to be Commerce Secretary. There was severe backlash from the Democrat Party at that time. They believed that a Republican in that position would politicize the census and not implement the policies of President Obama. The backlash was so intense that Mr. Gregg ended up withdrawing his nomination, but not before President Obama moved the census under the direct control of his Chief of Staff, Rahm Emanuel, the census czar, and it was being run out of the White House. Now, talk about politicizing the census. I'm just curious, where was the outrage from my Democrat colleagues then? Where was the request at that time for documents? What was the legal basis for that decision? Where was a letter from former census directors saying this blatantly political move would harm the integrity of the 2010 census? Well, none of us remember any of those details because they didn't happen. I can only imagine what the outrage would be today if President Trump had done the same thing. Mr. Chairman, today I think the end of the question here is that there should be no controversy in asking whether or not an individual is a citizen. We've got nearly 200 years of history of this. I think the resolution of inquiry is unnecessary. I urge the committee to report the resolution unfavorably, and I yield back.
Would my friend from Georgia yield for purposes of engagement?
Regrettably, my friend from Georgia yielded his time back, but I am going to recognize the gentlelady from New Jersey, and I don't know whether you want to engage or not, but the time belongs to the gentlelady from New Jersey.
Thank you very much for recognizing me, Mr. Chairman. I need to yield my time back to Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I will yield to the gentleman, Mr. Clay.
Thank you so much. Just for purposes of clarification, for my friend from Georgia who talked about the history of the citizenship question, here's why it stopped appearing after 1950. It's because in the 1940s, federal authorities used the data from the census question to round up Japanese Americans to put in camps. And so after that experience that we had as a country, we decided, I mean, look, we didn't need to question because it was used for nefarious purposes, and we paid for that indiscretion. And so that's why the question stopped, just to add some of the historic significance of why the question stopped. And I'm going to yield the rest of my time back to Mr. Wow. I yield to Cummings.
I want to yield to Mr. Raskin.
Well, thank you very much to the ranking member. Mr. Chairman, I know it's late in the day, and I usually don't like to say anything if I don't have anything new to add to the discussion, but I really did need to respond to the constitutional law analysis that was provided by Mr. Russell before, who argued that the Constitution essentially commands that voting be limited to citizens only. And there's two problems with that claim. One is it's completely irrelevant to the discussion of Mr. Gomez's proposed resolution of inquiry. The other is it's completely false. So let's start with why it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant because the census provision, as the gentlelady from New York pointed out, requires the counting of everybody who's here, regardless of whether or not they're a citizen or they're a voter. That's always the way it's been interpreted, and it's always what we've done. There's lots of people who aren't voters who are counted in the census, most obviously today children, but historically, of course, women were counted despite the fact that they couldn't vote, and African Americans were counted infamously as 3/5 for the purposes of reapportionment, despite the fact that virtually none of them were allowed to vote at the time. So the point about the claim that voting is limited to citizenship is completely irrelevant to the census question. But beyond that, I happen to have written a law review article about precisely the point he makes, that citizenship is a requirement for voting. And it's not. The vast majority of states, when America was started, gave non-citizens the right to vote. As long as they could meet the race, the gender, and the wealth and property requirements, they were allowed to vote. Their citizenship was considered completely irrelevant. Now, this became a huge bone of contention between the Republican and Democratic parties. The Republican Party, my friends across the aisle will be delighted to learn, were the great champions of alien suffrage. They thought this was a great way to get people acculturated to politics, and they wanted to extend voting rights to aliens in the country. Right before the Civil War, there were huge debates on the floor of the House and the Senate about alien voting, where the Republicans were the ones defending the practice. And when Lincoln was elected, in fact, he was attacked based on the idea that he won through the strength of the alien vote in New York and Illinois. The very first provision in the Confederate Constitution was no aliens can vote. You had to be a citizen of the Confederacy to vote. So after the Civil War, alien suffrage spread all the way across the country. A dozen new states adopted it, with, again, the Republican Party championing the right of aliens to vote. There's nothing in the Constitution, the Supreme Court said in a case called Minor versus Happersett and another one called Pope versus Williams, with extending the right to vote to aliens. It's an optional electorate, just like a state can enfranchise women before the 19th Amendment, or it can lower the voting age today to below 18. Non-citizens, not only have they been given the right to vote, they have the right to vote. In a number of jurisdictions in my state, I think it's something like 8 or 9 municipalities, non-citizens have the right to vote today. And they've been doing that since the beginning of the Republic. So the claim that the Constitution somehow confines voting only to naturalized citizens is completely ahistorical, and I'm sorry to say it's totally false. And I yield back.
I thank my friend Professor Raskin. That is the most number of nice things I've heard about the Republican Party and said in 5 minutes in the time I have been here. And I'm not surprised someone of your caliber would be the author of that. So thank you. I think we have
I'm glad
one
you
more-
took it as praise, Mr. Chairman.
I'm aware of one more speaker in the queue. I mean, anybody can talk that wants to, but I'm aware of the gentleman from Michigan, so I'll recognize him now.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That's what I want to know.
I appreciate Mr. Raskin's constitutional law. It's always useful to get a course that's just before dinner. Thank you. I'm not sure that, however, 1860s is really where we're currently at, but it's useful information. I have to start maybe a little off topic, but since it was raised that photo ID somehow is restricting the vote. You see, today I voted on the floor. It's got my photo on it. I don't think they're going to stop me from voting on the floor, but I have to have it.
Would the gentleman yield
No, I
for
will not.
engagement?
No, I will
Would
not.
you
It's my
like
5
to
minutes. Thank
engage
you.
me?
It's my 5 minutes, sir.
Okay.
I have to have this to drive in Michigan. If I'm stopped, I have to produce it. If it doesn't look like me, we have a problem. Now, you know, I've aged over time, but it's close enough for government work.
And we had a problem with people
excuse me,
voting
my time,
that
Mr.
weren't
Chair?
who they were?
Mr. Chair, it's my
Are
time.
you telling me
The
we had a
gentleman-
problem?
The gentleman from Michigan controls the time.
My colleague noted that both the long form for extended period of time and the American Community Survey continued asking a citizenship question. Now, I'm a policy geek, and I remember going through the census data as I went through my policy courses, and there wasn't a notable reference to a significant concern regarding the accuracy of the data by virtue of that question. Now, all of a sudden, there is. I'm lost to understand why it suddenly arises in this when, in fact, it's been asked. It's been asked under the previous administration in the ACS. It's been asked on a sampling of the long form for a long period of time until it was discontinued. But now suddenly the sky is falling. One of the reasons that have been brought up by media outlets as they look at this and they conflate it with a number of things is that, well, somehow immigrant communities fear answering the question because it will lead to deportation. My colleague, Mr. Gosar, asked directly that question of Mr. Gore. Now, by the way, I don't consider Mr. Gore to have been very collegial in his conversation at the committee. He offended me as well in some ways, but it is what it is. If we subpoenaed everybody that offended us, we'd be spending a lot of time here. Mr. Gosar asked, any questions in regards to citizenship that is answered on the census, could it be used by any law enforcement agency or judicial proceeding by the government? Mr. Gore, my understanding of the law is it could not be used in any immigration enforcement proceeding. Now, I asked, in follow-up, could he recall over the last 30 years, 20 years, 30 years, anybody that had been pursued for information on the census in any way, shape, or form? I asked him, I have not responded to items on the census. I said, has anybody been prosecuted for not responding to all the questions in the census? I chose not to respond to some. He couldn't recall any, nor did he have any of his knowledge. He readily admitted he looked at every instance. I acknowledge that. But he couldn't recall any. Yet somehow we have this massive concern by asking a simple question, a question that's been asked in other formats before, that people aren't going to respond to the census. There's been no evidence of that in the past, but we're concerned about it. And here's the other thing that I just don't understand why we spent an hour and a half here. When it's been indicated to us, and the chairman has conceded or acknowledged, when they file their response to litigation, they will respond to the questions. If they do not respond to the questions, I will join the chairman and vote to proceed with a subpoena for the questions we're entitled to. But to suggest that they respond to us prior to responding to a legal action, Mr. Raskin, you know better. You wouldn't do it if you were there. You can't do it until you make your filing. So let's be reasonable about this. Let's move on. If he doesn't respond, let's deal with him then. And I yield back, Mr. Chair. And I know I was only at 4 minutes, sir. Thank you.
The gentleman from Michigan yields back. The gentleman from Illinois seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield my time to Mr. Gomez.
Thank you so much. You know, to the gentleman from North Carolina's offer, first, you know, we are running out of time. The census goes to print this time next year. So any more stonewalling from the Department of Justice, then we're going to run out of time. We need to get full House action on this immediately. So my resolution would stop that stonewalling. Here's the thing. To the gentleman of North Carolina, if you actually voted for this to get to the floor, we all know that it's up to the speaker and leadership to determine if there's ever a vote. And I've seen recently that the gentleman from North Carolina.
Yeah, but if the gentleman would yield just for a second, you don't want me on it, because if I'm on it, it'll never come to the floor.
I was going to say, you proved very effective in getting bills passed and not passed in the last several weeks. So I would love to move it along, because in the end, you can decide if a bill comes up or not, or passes or not. And so I respect the gentleman from North Carolina's ability to do that. Additionally, this is, I believe, just a broader role that we're playing to keep a check on this executive. The questions that, the failure to answer the question of this committee by the Department of Justice and their conflicting responses from the Census Bureau, from Commerce, from the Department of Justice, it's bizarre, right? Because they've been enforcing the Voting Rights Act for the past 53 years without a problem. All of a sudden, there's a new administration. All of a sudden, they have a problem enforcing the Voting Rights Act, and that they need something at the census block level. Yes, it was on the American Community Survey. Yes, it was conducted on the long form. But also, the Secretary of Commerce admitted that the anti-immigrant fervor that's going on because of this administration, that they have already reduced the response rates to the census. So adding a question on citizenship in that context is going to have an impact. So I personally would love to see this go to the floor, show what your clout is about, and let's see if we can get there, and then make sure that we can work across the aisle. I would say far right and far left, but either way, we'll get to the people's business. So I greatly appreciate your consideration, and hopefully, you know, we have this motto up on top, e pluribus unum, right? Out of many, one. So let's do the people's business and pass this resolution.
Gentleman from California yields back. No other members seeking recognition. The question is now on adversely reporting House Resolution 877, with a recommendation the resolution not be agreed to. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs,
Recorded vote, please.
recorded vote being requested, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Gowdy.
Aye.
Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes aye. Mr. Sanford. Mr. Amash. Mr. Amash votes yes. Mr. Gosar. Mr. Gosar votes yes. Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Desjardins votes yes. Ms. Fox. Mr. Massey. Mr. Meadows. Mr. Meadows votes yes. Mr. DeSantis. Mr. DeSantis votes yes. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross votes yes. Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum. Mr. Blum votes aye. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Russell. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell votes yes. Mr. Gianforte. Mr. Gianforte votes yes. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney. Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton. Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Conley. Mr. Conley votes nay. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Kelly votes nay. Ms. Lawrence. Ms. Watson-Coleman. Ms. Watson-Coleman votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy. Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin votes nay. Mr. Gomez. Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Welch. Mr. Cartwright. Oh. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Desaulniers. No. Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no.
The gentleman from Kentucky.
Mr. Massey is not recorded. Mr. Massey votes yea.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Cartwright is not recorded. Mr. Cartwright votes no.
I usually wait till she finishes counting.
Great job.
The clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 20 ayes and 16 noes.
The ayes have it. House Resolution 877 is ordered adversely reported. Without objection, the motion is to reconsider as laid upon the table. Pursuant to notice, the committee will now consider the following postal naming bills en bloc: H.R. 4407, H.R. 4946, H.R. 5205, H.R. 5238, H.R. 5412, H.R. 5504, H.R. 5737, H.R. 5784. I ask unanimous consent the bills be ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, so ordered. In addition, pursuant to notice, I ask unanimous consent postal naming bill H.R. 4349 be ordered. Said 5349 be ordered favorably reported as amended by the amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. Without objection, so ordered. With that, I ask unanimous consent staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. There's no further business. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.